Merry Antichristmas! And welcome to Godless Reads, the Chilling Tales for Dark Night show where godless authors read their own stories. I'm Drew Stepek, owner of Godless.com and the Godless app. I'm coming to you on location from the Emser Tile Building in West Hollywood, California. During the Christmas season and the Antichristmas season, we're going to be doing on-location shoots from different Christmas movie locations. If you didn't know, this is where they filmed the jumper scene from the original Lethal Weapon movie. Lethal Weapon, like Die Hard, is a Christmas movie. This week, emerging author Ash Crowlin brings us his new story, A Very Magriol Christmas. A Very Magriol Christmas is a story about a man who sells his soul to the devil to possibly sire the Antichrist. Nothing says Christmas like the Antichrist. Ash Crowlin is one of the many emerging authors who just started releasing stuff on Godless. So if you want to get into some new horror and something different, go to Godless.com and check out the emerging section. It's awesome, so kick back, grab your drug of choice, and dig into this Antichristmas tale by Ash Crowlin, A Very Magriol Christmas.
A Very Magriol Christmas by Ash Crowlin. Read by Ash Crowlin. Magrill loved eggnog. Next to inventing sick new ways to mutilate, murder, and mock, there's nothing the demon loved more than pint after pint of the Yuletide treat. Netter, a mage who'd served the devil since childhood, knew precious little about Magrill, but the eggnog bit made him grin as he set about preparing the trap within his small, one-room log cabin. It was more of a glorified shed, really. Netter had no use for extra space or material objects other than his bed, a few clothing items, and pelts from the various wildlife he caught each morning and slaughtered for food. He had a wife once, but she was a heretic who turned to the dreamy warblings of Christian ministers after giving birth to their daughter, Elise. Like all those things he had no space for, he disposed of his former lover just a few months ago, and he sent their infant daughter far away to live in the city with all their filth. It was the former action that had garnered him the attention of his lord. Netter smiled as he took down the room's only set of curtains, dirty old green things, and replaced them with a newly bought white set. Presentation was paramount, the devil had told him. His red blood and entrails would look so much richer splattered across contrasting whites. Netter would die tonight, on Christmas Eve. By Christmas Day, his family's legacy in hell would be assured. The devil hadn't gone into many specifics about why the trap was being set, and it was up to Netter to put context clues together. Magrill was a nasty son of a bitch, too powerful, too reckless to be affiliated with hell any longer. Most demons born with borderline godlike abilities had ambition, which was always something the devil smiled upon, but Magrill squandered his gifts only on sickening displays and perversity for perversity's sake, and it set a bad example for other up-and-coming servants of hell. He was the bad apple that would ruin the bushel, so to speak. That's where the stone board came into play. It sat on the table in the center of the room, a square tablet with various yellow symbols inscribed on its face. The symbols were absolutely meaningless, as far as Netter could tell. He pored over dozens of tomes on ancient languages since the board had been left on his doorstep 3 days ago, and the symbols matched none of them. He noticed they changed every time he left the room, too. They were merely camouflage for a deadly predator, an actor's makeup. Netter's job was simple. Just sit in front of the board when he was ready, and begin playing with it like it was a game. This would lure Magrill into the cabin, and the demon would slaughter Netter in horrible fashion before the board opened up and swallowed him. Only this time, the board wouldn't just take its prisoner. It would also capture the demon while he joyfully went about slaughtering Netter. The betrayal was an easy operation, sure, but Netter was admittedly nervous when he thought about the promise of a gruesome death, and his own death was far from his biggest worry. There was also the matter of his son, Stephen. He was 8 years old, and by far the greatest gift his former wife had given him before turning heretic. He'd sent the boy off toward the city with his 2 servants, who he trusted well enough. Corlin was an oafish and moon-faced teenager, sure, but he was brutally strong and could crush rocks between his bare hands. The other, a wonderfully advanced protege named Aster, was smart as a whip, and knew enough basic magic to keep them safe during their journey. Aster was beautiful, too. Even in black robes, the outline of her busty chest caught Netter's gaze, and her seductive smile and curly blonde hair was perfect as any whore in his fantasies. After his wife's execution, he considered taking Aster as a lover, but it was never to be. She treated Stephen like a little brother, and Netter couldn't bring himself to foul that up with his own carnal desires. He thought of the boy's bright blue eyes, and how they looked up at Netter with so much fear as he sent them away hours ago.
Who's going to protect you, Papa?
The boy had asked. Netter did his best not to cry right then. The boy had a good heart. Don't worry about me. Worry about protecting Crowlin and the wench. They'll need a strong man like you to look out for them.
But when can we come back?
Soon, Netter lied. Just stick to the path on the map and don't stop till you reach the city. Be brave, son. The boy hugged Netter's waist.
Hail Satan, Papa.
He said quietly. Netter had sworn to himself he wouldn't hug his son back. He wanted Stephen's final image of his father to be someone stoic and powerful, not some soft-hearted weakling. But he hugged Stephen anyway. Tightly. We'll be safe, Esther promised him quietly. She made the sign of the devil's horns with her pinky and index fingers, ever the faithful servant. We'll teach him the ways when he's ready. He'll know of your sacrifice. Netter pushed these thoughts aside, berating himself for worrying about something as petty as family when there are far greater gifts ahead. His family would be royalty after this. It was promised to him in the years to come, someone in his line would birth the devil's unholy spawn. That was the reward for Netter's sacrifice, and it was all that mattered to him now. He still felt foolish for how he'd initially greeted the generous offer. The devil himself had been in his home, a large and smoky figure with hellfire eyes and all the infernal majesty Netter could have imagined. And stupidly, amateurishly, he'd asked, "You mean the Antichrist? You'd give my family that honor?" The devil must have pitied the desperation in Netter's voice, because after a moment of silence, he'd only asked,
"Will it be done, or won't it?"
Oh, how Netter had berated himself after he'd agreed to the terms and the devil had disappeared. Stupid, stupid, stupid. He pushed the thoughts of his embarrassment away. He would redeem himself tonight. If his bloody sacrifice was what the master wanted, he would smile joyfully as he was ripped limb from limb. There was a knock at the door. Strange, Netter thought as he set down the new curtains. He picked up a short blade from the stovetop as he looked toward the window. There was no light on the patio. What use would he have for one, so far from society? And all he could make out in the darkness was a tall and burly shape. The shape held a large sack over one shoulder, bulging with the shape of boxes inside. The knock came again, light-hearted and rhythmic. "Go away!" Netter shouted. He had no neighbors, and nobody worth a damn had any reason to know him anyway. The figure outside chuckled joyfully.
"Ho, ho, ho!"
The shape called.
"Be a good little warlock and let Santa inside."
Warlock, Netter thought. Either it was one of his wife's old friends or someone else with a death wish. "Piss off or I'll slit your throat!" Netter shouted. The shape outside laughed again, and there was a scraping sound from the other side of the door as if sharp nails were gouging the wood.
"Don't be a naughty little boy, Netter."
The stranger's voice was absent of joy now, just a throaty growl.
"Old Magrill brings coal and carnage to those who are on his naughty list."
Netter's blood went cold. He looked at the stone board on the table, wondering if he was the one who'd been betrayed. It didn't move, but he heard its voice speaking directly into his brain. This wasn't part of the plan. Magrill was supposed to wait until his victims began toiling with the board before arriving and attacking. There was always how the duo worked together, and how the sacrificial ritual worked each time. The board acted as bait, luring victims in by appearing as some sort of game or interesting object, and its sharp edges drew blood from unwary users as an involuntary sacrifice. Then, and only then, was Magrill supposed to show up and slaughter victims however he saw fit, leaving scraps for the board to harvest along with the victims' souls. But then, who could expect an unruly demon to respect such rituals? The nasty, gore-obsessed monster was playing its own game now. Netter heard the board's irritated dismay as it came to the same conclusion. "That idiot!" it said. "Stupid, childish idiot!" There was a long scurrying sound from outside the cabin, and suddenly Netter heard what sounded like multiple animals climbing the wall toward the rooftop. Outside, the burly shape was suddenly gone, disappearing into a small burst of smoke. Dust rained down the chimney as it stomped closer and closer toward it from up above. Netter's first impulse was to try and run, cowardly as he was. He steadied himself, though, thinking only of the great reward awaiting his family name. But then another thought corrected him. Magrill assumed he was catching him off guard, and any sane person would try to flee. And a mage would put up a hell of an effort, wouldn't he? He held an open palm toward the fireplace and muttered a bit of gibberish. The words never mattered, only the intent behind them, but loud gibberish made a much better spectacle if Magrill was listening. A translucent blue wall appeared like smokescreen in front of the fireplace. It would delay the bastard for only a moment, which would make enough of a convincing effort. In the meantime, Netter would run toward the town, pretending to flee for his life but tripping accidentally along the way. Magrill would catch him and dispatch him in no time. Netter picked up the board to open the front door, and a collection of dismembered limbs leapt upon him, catching him by surprise and causing him to drop the board. A pair of severed hands, large feet, two halves of a human head, and a long and bloody spinal column all attacked him, each gnawing at his flesh with individual mouths of their own. Each attacker had strange little hands grown like twisted vines from their bodies, and they clawed at his skin with the razor-sharp nails. Netter fought the attackers off as he screamed in surprise and fell backward toward the floor. He grabbed one of the enormous hands and threw it toward the fireplace, and it sizzled and fell to dust when it struck the blue barrier. He caught a glimpse of the two halves of the face staring up at him, one from his left ankle and the other from his shoulder. He recognized Corlin's ugly features. His heart skipped a beat. There was a crash as the larger body dropped down the chimney, and through the brief cloud of black ashes, Netter saw two fiery eyes staring at him from the dry and blackened face below a yellowish crown of thorns. Magriol's permanent smile stretched wider as he waved a dismissive hand, and the blue barrier disappeared.
Ho ho ho!
The bastard shouted as he stepped out of the fireplace. The top of his scarred head nearly touched the ceiling when he stood at full height.
I bring great tidings of love and joy.
The demon pulled the heavy red sack along behind him, leaving a long trail of blood. He bent down and pinched one of Netter's cheeks.
I've been watching you for days now, little mage,
he said proudly. The demon gestured toward the near-empty room.
And what's this? No Christmas decorations? No spirit for the season? Well, we just can't tolerate that now, can we?
Netter fought in vain as Corlin's spinal column wrapped tightly around his knees, nearly crushing them. Magrill drew a bottle of eggnog from the inside of his gory red outfit and drank heavily.
Let's start off with a good old gift exchange, shall we?
He said. Netter raised a hand toward the ceiling. He could bring the roof down on them both and it wouldn't do much harm, but it would be a damn convincing act. But suddenly his hand didn't obey him. He heard laughter coming from his palm as a horrible arthritic pain claimed everything above the wrist, and before he could even process where the pain could be coming from, the skin over each of his knuckles burst open, and 4 laughing faces gawked at him from the ends of his bared bones. His fingers each grew arms of their own from their middle joints, and they ripped themselves from his palm and fell to the floor. Netter did his best to hold back a pained scream, but he heard the board sighing with displeasure. That's quite sufficient, it said in his mind. The letters on its face grew with a faint blue light. You've offered blood, and I accept the sacrifice. I'm weary of this idiot's games. No! Netter cried. Magrill laughed, likely assuming the objection was to the torture. Netter resisted the urge to speak out loud, hoping the board could hear his thoughts. He stared at the large sack Magrill had dragged in. If he'd gotten to Corlin, and he works that strange twisted magic on him, I need to see what's in the packages, he told the board silently. I need to know if my boy is safe. The board groaned. As you wish, it said. Though I believe you already know the answer. Netter banished horrible images that flooded his mind. Esther was a cunning student. His boy would be safe. The dismembered limbs picked Netter up and carried him toward the bulging sack of gifts. Netter's dismembered fingers crawled toward his face and pried his eyes wide open, forcing him to watch.
Now,
Magrill said, dumping the sack on the floor and picking up the larger of 2 boxes.
little Corlin will go first. He's really losing his head waiting.
The demon cackled loudly at his own joke, slapping his knee like it was the funniest thing anyone had ever said. Even with the horrible pain in his mutilated hand, Netter cringed at the lame joke. The board had told him Magrill was far more annoying than he was scary, but he hadn't expected lazy puns. One half of Corlin's bisected hand retrieved the box from Magrill and dragged it toward Netter. Netter's reanimated fingers jumped down from his face to tear at the wrapping paper. Only, now that he looked closely, Netter could see it wasn't paper at all. Esther had only one tattoo on her body, a large red S woven through 2 opposing circles, just above her left hip. Netter had glimpsed it once when she was bathing outside, and the image had been forever burned in his mind. The tattoo stared at him from atop the package, and he could see her belly button stretched taut down the side of the box with bloody strands of her curly blonde hair stitching together portions of her flayed skin. His heart sank at the sight. My boy could still be safe, he told himself. It's possible. It's possible. Flayed skin or not, the gift's wrappings made a crumpling sound similar to paper as it was ripped away. Somehow this was what disturbed Netter most about the gruesome display. Magrill had all the power of a minor god, and he used it only to add such disgusting touches to his work.
Well,
Magrill cried as he reached into the open box.
what do we have here? Take a look, little mage.
Before Netter could pull the box's contents out, a pale and slender hand rose from within and reached up and seized his arm. A body rose from the box, and Netter's eyes widened as the woman stood on her bare feet. Rather, bare foot. Only one side of Esther's body had any skin or muscle left on it. On the other side of a line, perfectly bisecting her clothed half from her naked skeleton, only red and green Christmas tinsel decorated her bare bones. He didn't see recognition in her dead stare, though she grinned at him stupidly as she knelt on one knee and held bloody mistletoe over his head.
Aw, now isn't that sweet?
Magrill said, holding both hands beneath his chin in mock adoration. Esther leaned in to kiss Netter, and he felt completely numb as the still warm lips of her corpse touched his lips, and the naked bones of one hand brushed his beard. All at once, he felt like such a fool, nothing but a child playing make-believe while the big kids had true power. He heard the board grumble in agreement. Really, you don't have to subject yourself to this. Magrill does not play fairly, and he will only toy with you further. Your son is dead. You've done enough. No, Netter cried out in his mind. I have to see. I have to know. Suit yourself, the board dismissed. I'll be waiting. Esther's puppet corpse pried Netter's lips open with her tongue. He felt it worm around inside his mouth, stretching all the way back to his tonsils and making him gag. He kept his eyes on the smallest of the boxes, thinking only of his sweet baby boy. Please, 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 he prayed silently. He no longer cared if it was the devil who heard his prayers. He'd settle for any god that was listening. Let my boy be safe. Don't let him be in there. Magrill guzzled a second carton of eggnog noisily, letting it run down the front of his Santa suit and splatter to the blood-soaked floor.
Now for your other present,
he said, tossing the carton aside.
My dear, if you'd be so kind.
The demon gestured to Esther, and she obediently pushed the second package across the floor. This one was slightly smaller, too small to fit his young son. Foolishly, Netter felt a fleeting moment of hope. He tore off the wet red wrapping paper. This time, it at least was just paper. Two small arms lunged at him from the box and wrapped around his neck.
Papa!
Stephen shouted, springing from the box. Actually, springing from the box. From the waist down, Stephen's lower body was twisted and broken. Both legs snapped and wrapped in fleshy coils with bits of broken bone piercing the skin in several places. He sprung up and down joyously as he embraced his father. No! No! Netter choked out quietly, absently stroking his son's hair as he stared emptily toward the spinning room. You were supposed to stay on the path. You were supposed to be safe. She swore she'd keep you safe! Stephen pushed away from him.
But we were safe, Papa,
he said. Netter screamed when he saw what had become of his son's face. His son's scalp and jaw were still intact, but everything in between had been scooped away and repurposed. Both eyes and all the upper teeth floated, along with his severed nose, within the orb of an oversized snow globe lodged in his skull. His son leapt up and down in his deformed legs, causing this makeshift snow to dance within his head. Netter screamed on, unable to stop the tears. Magrill laughed in delight, and Stephen took his father's head between his hands and forced him to look at the orb.
Look what I made, Papa,
he said happily from a mouth that didn't even exist. The bottom of the snow globe lit up green and red, illuminating a series of miniature characters made of bone. Netter saw these moving parodies were dressed as Corlin, Esther, and his son. These figures walked along the path Netter had mapped out for them, each specific mark identifying the route. In the background of the scene, he saw a pair of gleaming red eyes in the shadows. So that was it then. Magrill had already known about the planned escape routes. They said the devil was in the details. Netter had been promised one of his descendants would birth the Antichrist. That left only the daughter, birthed to him by his heretic wife. He never had been promised his son would also be safe. He thought of his wife, the woman whose execution at his own hands had earned him the devil's attention, and all that came with it. He'd killed his wife for her beliefs, certain at the time it was the right thing to do. And she died smiling, secure in her faith that the Christian God Netter had been taught to loathe would forgive everything she'd done. If all her beliefs had led him here, to this horrible heartache he'd never dreamed could happen, what use were these beliefs to him anymore? He told Corlin and Esther to keep his son on a path, and they'd done so obediently, and the path he laid out for them ended up only in their gory destruction. Have you finally seen enough? The board spoke inside of his head. Can we get this over with already? The board's tone infuriated Netter. He looked around the room. His half-skinned beauty Esther, his mutilated oafish servant, his horribly deformed son. The festively dressed master of their fates laughed on, lying on the floor and making angels in the pool of blood. None of this would be happening if Netter hadn't been tricked into luring the creature to his home, putting everyone close to him in danger. But he hadn't been tricked. He knew the risks when he accepted the task. It was his own selfishness that had been his undoing. The devil had known his desire for the family line to become somehow important, and he manipulated him like a puppet on strings. He had nothing else to lose now, nowhere else to turn. He wouldn't play along any further. He looked toward the ceiling. Father above, forgive me, he cried. I was wrong about everything. I accept Christ as my savior. I accept the sacrifice of your only son. I accept everything and anything you want me to accept. Magrill must have mistaken this for lunacy.
Oh, no,
he chided.
None of that just yet. Tonight's festivities have only just begun. You're not allowed to fall into madness until I'm good and ready to see it, little mage. And then the board's allowed to take you.
Allowed? The board grumbled.
Enough entertainment, mage. You've seen your dead son. I'm taking the idiot now.
Just let me see my son again. I beg you, Netter continued, ignoring the demon and the board. I've done unforgivable things, and I accept my own fate. Please just let me see my son again. Magrill swatted across the back of his head.
Who do you think you're talking to?
He demanded.
Pay attention to me, little mage. I'm the one with all the fun games to be played.
Netter cocked his head toward the board. You've been set up, he told Magrill. The devil wants to be rid of you. Your friend here, He's in on it too. Magrill's smile twitched uncertainly. His eyes flitted between Netter and the board. What are you doing? The board demanded. Netter smiled, and he nodded to Magriol. So go on. Kill me already. You've already lost. Enough! The board cried. The lettering on top suddenly glowed, and there was a crack like thunder as the middle of the board broke open from corner to corner. Magriol's macabre creations frowned at him, dumbfounded. His smile was completely gone now, and the red glow in his eyes seemed to die like twin smoldering flames. He shook his head at the board, retreating as far as the tiny shack allowed. A thin red tendril shot from the opening in the board, and wrapped itself around Magriol's right arm and pulled it tight. All his creations around the room melted away like wax figures as he screamed in protest and newfound terror. Netter crawled forward on his hands and knees and cradled the remains of his son, content to hold him all the way to his death as he watched the tormentors capture. Magrill roared in resistance, snapping his fingers at Corlin's lifeless body. The servant's chest suddenly burst open, and a set of ribs came running out on his stubby white legs, leaping up onto the tendril and gnawing at it with tiny teeth. You! The board shouted in Netter's mind. Filthy traitor! Your suffering's only just begun. You just wait! A tendril rose above all the others, coiling like a snake ready to strike at Netter. Netter looked past it, toward whatever god watched from above, toward the same god he'd slain his wife for loving. Just let me see my son again, he begged. Please, Lord. Please. Netter heard the demon's croaking laughter. He looked toward the bastard and saw him suspended above the floor by his throat, with his arms and legs splayed out and held firmly by dozens of other tendrils.
Your boy's dead.
He spat, half strangled. Drool and blood and broken teeth fell from his mouth as he cackled on and on. Please, Netter continued. I'll do anything, whatever you command. The coiled tendril shot at Netter, aimed to pierce his heart, and a brilliant white light appeared in front of him, shielding him from harm and cooking the tendril with a loud sizzle. Netter shielded his eyes, but the light was already gone. He heard the board scream in agony, cries of the damned in his mind never fathomed. Magrill opened his mouth, but he couldn't speak further as the tendril around his neck grew tighter and he was pulled toward the board's mouth. He merely smiled at Netter as his feet disappeared into the board, then his waist, and finally his whole body. The last Netter saw of him was a bastard's sinister grin. The board closed, and the room was suddenly silent. Corlin and Esther's mangled bodies remained on the floor, but Stephen's body had disappeared. Netter scrambled to his feet, overturning several pieces of debris, searching under everything he could find. He screamed in frustration when he found nothing, no trace of his son. He sat on his knees and wept loudly, shouting for Magriol, shouting for the devil, shouting for any god that would hear his pleas. No one answered. Take me, he begged the board. That was the deal, you have to take me. Let me die. The board said nothing. Silence. Netter's punishment for betrayal. He threw the board across the room, and it made a large crack in the wall as it struck. And then he felt a warmth against his back, like a warm wind blowing. When he turned around, expecting an answer to his death pleas, he was again greeted by only nothing. No, not nothing. There's a very faint white line, only as tall as he was. He saw the space around the white line billow, distorting reality on both sides like a large white gash in a curtain. The gash opened slightly wider as another warm wind blew from within. Behind the tear in reality, he saw a small figure facing him, cloaked in a shadow despite the bright white light surrounding it. A light that got brighter as the gash widened more and more. Who are you? He asked, eyes twitching as his whole body shook. Was it even possible to be both freezing cold and burning at the same time? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it extended a small hand. His son's hand. It beckoned him forward.
Papa.
Stephen said. His voice sounded like a haunted whisper, nothing like his true voice at all.
It's okay, Papa. He has plans for you. Come with me. There's more to see.
Netter looked at the board on the other side of the room, wondering if it had some part of this. No. He knew it was asleep now, content with its prized prisoner. He felt that the magic had drained from his body. Perhaps it, too, had abandoned him. His son's figure beckoned him forward again, but the hand was starting to retreat. The gash was starting to close, the white light growing smaller and smaller. There was no telling what awaited him on the other side. Could it be heaven? Hell? An alternative, perhaps? It didn't much matter, regardless. He was a broken man. Anywhere was better than a world where he'd lost his family. He took Stephen's hand and pulled him gently into the disappearing gash. All that was left in the small cabin was a silent board and the festively decorated dead.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.